A black SUV spun sideways across a rain-soaked mountain road, smashed through a guardrail, and disappeared into darkness. The impact was so violent that shattered glass rained through the cabin like ice, and for a terrifying moment, 26-year-old Isabella Monroe couldn't breathe. Blood trickled down her forehead. The doors were jammed shut. Smoke filled the vehicle, and somewhere beyond the twisted metal, gunshots echoed through the storm. Isabella had spent her entire life believing money could solve almost anything. Tonight, she was about to discover how wrong she had been. Less than 12 hours earlier, Isabella was standing beneath crystal chandeliers inside one of Connecticut's most exclusive estates, laughing with friends while servers carried silver trays worth more than most Americans earned in a month. As the only daughter of millionaire businessman and Senate frontrunner Richard Monroe, she had grown accustomed to a world where private jets arrived on command, luxury cars waited at every curb, and problems disappeared before they could reach her doorstep. Danger was something that happened to other people. At least, that's what she believed. What Isabella didn't know was that several miles away, a group of men were already planning an attack that would make national headlines. They knew her routine. They knew her favorite restaurants. They knew the routes her drivers preferred. Most disturbing of all, they knew exactly when she would be alone. The plan had been developing for weeks, hidden beneath layers of secrecy that even experienced investigators would later struggle to untangle. And by the time anyone realized what was happening, it would almost be too late. Standing quietly in the corner of the Monroe estate that evening was a man named Ethan Cole. At 34 years old, Ethan looked nothing like the wealthy executives surrounding Isabella's family. He wore a simple dark suit. His watch was inexpensive. His truck had more miles than Isabella's sports cars combined. To her, Ethan represented everything she had spent years avoiding. Responsibility, rules, limits. He had been hired to protect her because of growing security concerns surrounding her father's Senate campaign. But from the moment they met, Isabella made it clear she wanted nothing to do with him. For months, she mocked him whenever she had the chance. She joked about his salary. She laughed at his old truck. She referred to him as hired help even when he was standing a few feet away. Her friends followed her lead, treating him as though he barely existed. Yet Ethan never argued, never complained, never defended himself. He simply did his job. What Isabella mistook for weakness was actually discipline, forged through years of military service and experiences she knew nothing about. And soon, that discipline would become the only reason she survived. Because as Isabella sat trapped inside that wrecked SUV, surrounded by darkness and gunfire, the millionaire heiress who once laughed at her bodyguard was about to place her life entirely in his hands. In less than 60 seconds, Ethan Cole would make a decision that changed both of their lives forever. A decision that would leave him fighting for his life in a hospital bed. A decision that would force Isabella to confront the truth about the man she had spent months humiliating. And before this story is over, you'll discover why the secret Ethan had been hiding all along was even more shocking than the attack itself. Before we dive deeper, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 6 months earlier, Richard Monroe seemed unstoppable. After building one of the largest logistics companies in the Northeast, the 62-year-old businessman had shifted his attention to politics, launching a Senate campaign that quickly dominated headlines across Connecticut. Television networks followed his every move. Political analysts called him the favorite. Major donors poured millions into his campaign. With election season approaching, Richard's face appeared on billboards, television screens, and newspaper covers almost daily. To supporters, he represented a successful outsider ready to challenge Washington. To his opponents, he represented a threat that needed to be stopped. The more popular Richard became, the more disturbing the warnings grew. At first, they seemed insignificant. Angry emails arrived at campaign offices. Late-night phone calls interrupted staff meetings. Anonymous messages appeared online, accusing him of things that investigators quickly proved were false. But then the threats became personal. Handwritten letters began arriving at family properties. Some contained detailed information about places Richard had recently visited. Others mentioned members of his family by name. Whoever was sending them wasn't guessing. They were watching. The situation escalated when campaign security discovered the same dark-colored sedan parked near 3 separate Monroe properties over a period of 2 weeks. The vehicle would appear for hours at a time before disappearing without explanation. Security cameras occasionally captured blurry images of individuals lingering near gates and entrances. Nothing illegal occurred, but the pattern was impossible to ignore. Federal authorities reviewed the evidence and reached a troubling conclusion. There was no immediate threat they could prove, but the Monroe family had likely become the target of organized surveillance. Richard took the warning seriously. He had spent decades building businesses and understood that success often attracted enemies. But this felt different. These weren't random critics expressing political disagreements. Whoever was behind the threats appeared patient, deliberate, and increasingly bold. Within days, Richard expanded security across every part of his life. Additional personnel were assigned to campaign events. Vehicles were upgraded. Travel schedules became confidential. Most importantly, he ordered round-the-clock protection for the person he worried about most, his daughter, Isabella. Unfortunately, Isabella Monroe viewed the entire situation as a dramatic overreaction. At 26 years old, she had spent most of her life insulated from consequences. The threats seemed distant and abstract compared to the glamorous world she occupied. While her father discussed security briefings and risk assessments, Isabella was attending charity galas, luxury parties, and exclusive social events. Every warning sounded the same to her. Every security recommendation felt like another attempt to control her freedom. She insisted nobody would ever target her because she wasn't involved in politics. Their arguments became frequent. Richard pleaded with her to take the situation seriously. Isabella rolled her eyes and accused him of being paranoid. The more he pushed, the more resistant she became. She hated security details. She hated schedules. Most of all, she hated the idea of someone following her everywhere she went. To Isabella, the bodyguard her father planned to assign wasn't protection. He was a symbol of everything she refused to become: cautious, restricted, and afraid. What neither Richard nor Isabella knew was that somewhere beyond the campaign headquarters, beyond the television interviews and public appearances, someone was already paying very close attention to those disagreements. Someone who had learned an important truth. Richard Monroe was heavily protected. Isabella Monroe was not. And in a dangerous game where leverage meant everything, that distinction would soon make her the most valuable target of all. A week later, Richard Monroe called his daughter into his office and informed her that the decision had already been made. Her new bodyguard would begin immediately. Isabella prepared herself to meet another overly serious security professional who would blindly follow orders. Instead, she walked into the room and came face to face with a man named Ethan Cole. And from the moment their eyes met, everything began to change. At 26 years old, Isabella Monroe lived in a world that looked more like a magazine cover than real life. Her social media accounts were filled with photographs from private islands, luxury resorts, and charity galas attended by celebrities and politicians. She traveled on private jets more often than commercial flights. Designer handbags filled closets larger than most apartments. Invitations to exclusive events arrived almost daily. If there was a party worth attending in New York, Miami, or Los Angeles, chances were Isabella Monroe was already on the guest list. To the outside world, she appeared to have everything: wealth, beauty, influence, connections. But years of privilege had created a dangerous blind spot. Isabella had spent so much of her life surrounded by protection and comfort that she genuinely believed consequences were things that happened to other people. Rules felt optional. Warnings felt exaggerated. Problems always seemed to disappear before they reached her. When security experts discussed threats, she heard inconvenience. When her father spoke about danger, she heard control. Richard Monroe often worried that success had given his daughter a false sense of invincibility. Friends who challenged her opinions rarely stayed around for long. Employees rarely disagreed with her. People constantly adjusted their behavior to accommodate her. Without realizing it, Isabella had grown accustomed to being the most important person in every room she entered. She expected attention. She expected compliance. And when she didn't receive either, frustration usually followed. That was exactly why Richard chose Ethan Cole. At 34 years old, Ethan represented almost everything Isabella wasn't. He had spent years serving in some of the most dangerous environments imaginable as an Army Ranger. Multiple deployments had taken him across the world. He had received military honors for bravery under fire, including a silver star that remained tucked away in a box he rarely mentioned. After leaving the military, Ethan spent years rebuilding a civilian life from scratch. There were no trust funds, no wealthy connections, no safety nets waiting to catch him if he failed. Most people who met Ethan assumed he had always been poor. The truth was far more complicated. His family had once lived comfortably before a devastating business collapse erased nearly everything they owned. Ethan watched his parents lose their home. He watched financial pressure tear relationships apart. Instead of feeling entitled to sympathy, he learned to work. Construction sites, security contracts, long hours, difficult jobs. Every achievement in his life had been earned the hard way. Unlike Isabella Monroe, Ethan understood exactly how quickly fortunes could disappear. The contrast between them couldn't have been more obvious. The first meeting happened inside Richard Monroe's private office overlooking downtown Hartford. Richard introduced Ethan with genuine respect, describing his military record and professional reputation. Ethan nodded politely and extended his hand. Isabella barely looked at it. Instead, her attention drifted toward the inexpensive watch on his wrist, then to the simple suit he wore. Through the office window, she noticed the aging pickup truck parked outside among luxury vehicles worth several times its value. A faint smile crossed her face. "You're my bodyguard?" she asked. The room immediately grew uncomfortable. Richard frowned. Ethan remained expressionless. It wasn't the words that bothered people. It was the tone, the assumption, the judgment. For a brief moment, Isabella expected Ethan to defend himself or react with embarrassment. Instead, he simply replied, "Yes, ma'am." That response irritated her more than she expected. Over the following weeks, their relationship only became worse. Isabella treated Ethan less like a professional and more like an unwanted inconvenience. When she attended expensive restaurants with friends, she intentionally made him wait outside for hours. At parties, she introduced him sarcastically as her babysitter. More than once she joked about his truck in front of wealthy guests. She nicknamed him Soldier Boy and used it whenever she wanted to provoke him. Her friends laughed. Ethan never did. One evening, while returning from a yacht event in Newport, Isabella openly mocked what she assumed he earned in a year. The conversation sent several of her friends into laughter. Ethan remained silent, staring out the window as though he hadn't heard a word. That reaction frustrated Isabella more than any argument could have. She wanted him annoyed. She wanted him offended. She wanted proof that she could get under his skin. Instead, Ethan treated every insult the same way he treated bad weather. Something temporary that wasn't worth his attention. What Isabella failed to understand was that Ethan wasn't ignoring her because he lacked confidence. He was ignoring her because he had survived things far worse than hurt feelings. Weeks passed. The campaign intensified. Security concerns continued growing. And while Isabella remained focused on parties and social events, Ethan quietly paid attention to details everyone else overlooked. Then one night, after escorting her home from a charity fundraiser in New Haven, something finally caught his attention. A black sedan, parked across the street. At first it seemed ordinary, until Ethan remembered seeing the exact same vehicle 3 days earlier outside a luxury restaurant in Greenwich, and again the week before near a private event in Manhattan. The same make, the same color, the same tinted windows. As the sedan slowly pulled away into the darkness, a feeling settled in Ethan's stomach that he hadn't experienced in years. Someone was watching Isabella Monroe, and whoever it was had been doing it for a very long time. Over the next several days, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the black sedan wasn't a coincidence. Years of military training had taught him to trust patterns, and the pattern surrounding Isabella Monroe was becoming impossible to ignore. Instead of immediately sounding alarms, he began investigating quietly. He reviewed security logs, studied surveillance footage, and compared schedules from recent events. The deeper he looked, the more troubling the situation became. Small incidents that seemed unrelated on their own suddenly formed a picture that suggested someone was operating much closer to Isabella than anyone realized. The first discovery involved her phone. A cybersecurity specialist hired by the Monroe campaign detected unusual activity connected to Isabella's accounts. Several login attempts had originated from locations she had never visited. Private information appeared to have been accessed without authorization. While investigators worked to determine the extent of the breach, Isabella dismissed the entire issue as a technical glitch. To her, hacked accounts were an inconvenience, not a warning sign. Ethan disagreed. Whoever was behind it wasn't looking for money. They were looking for information. Then came the security cameras. One morning, technicians discovered that cameras covering a side entrance at a Monroe property had mysteriously stopped recording for nearly 2 hours. There was no obvious explanation. The equipment showed no signs of damage. Yet the outage occurred during the exact window when an unidentified individual had reportedly been seen near the property. Security teams increased patrols, but the incident left Ethan with more questions than answers. Someone seemed determined to test the family's defenses without revealing themselves. The strange emails started arriving shortly afterward. Most contained nothing overtly threatening. Instead, they referenced locations Isabella had recently visited or events she had attended. Some mentioned details that weren't publicly available. One email described the exact dress she wore to a private fundraiser attended by fewer than 50 guests. Another referenced a conversation she had held inside a members-only club. The messages never demanded anything. They simply reminded her that someone was watching. Isabella laughed them off. Ethan didn't. As election season intensified, reports of unfamiliar individuals appearing near Monroe campaign events continued to surface. Witnesses described people who attended rallies without interacting with anyone. Others noticed unfamiliar faces photographing entrances, parking lots, and security checkpoints. None of it was enough to justify arrests. None of it clearly violated the law. But each new report added another layer of concern. Ethan felt increasingly certain that the surveillance wasn't random. Someone was preparing for something. Meanwhile, Isabella continued living exactly as she always had. If anything, the warnings made her even more determined to prove she couldn't be controlled. She attended exclusive rooftop parties in Manhattan, spent weekends at private yacht gatherings, and accepted invitations to luxury events across the East Coast. Every security recommendation felt like a challenge she was determined to resist. If Ethan advised against attending an event, she wanted to go even more. If her father requested caution, she pushed harder for independence. The more danger surrounded her, the less seriously she seemed to take it. The growing conflict placed Richard Monroe in an impossible position. He was fighting one of the most important political battles of his life, while constantly worrying about his daughter's safety. Late at night, after campaign meetings ended, he often called Isabella personally. He begged her to cooperate with security protocols. He reminded her that threats against public figures could escalate quickly. He explained that protecting her wasn't about control. It was about survival. But every conversation seemed to end the same way. Isabella accused him of overreacting, and Richard was left wondering whether tragedy would arrive before understanding did. Even Ethan's warnings failed to break through her confidence. More than once, he privately explained his concerns and encouraged her to take precautions. He never spoke down to her. He never raised his voice. He simply presented facts and asked her to be careful. Isabella usually responded with sarcasm. She couldn't understand why a man who had spent years facing real danger seemed so concerned about situations she considered harmless. What she didn't realize was that Ethan had learned something important during his military service. Most disasters don't announce themselves before they arrive. Then came the charity gala. The event took place inside a historic waterfront mansion outside Greenwich. Politicians, business leaders, and influential donors filled the ballroom. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors, while photographers documented every important arrival. To most guests, it was another glamorous evening. To Ethan, it was another environment filled with variables he couldn't fully control. As usual, he remained alert while Isabella moved effortlessly through the crowd, greeting friends and attracting attention wherever she went. That was when he noticed the man. Standing near the edge of the room was an unfamiliar guest holding what appeared to be a professional camera. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Events like this often attracted photographers. But something about his behavior stood out. He wasn't documenting the event. He wasn't taking pictures of politicians or donors. Every time Ethan looked in his direction, the camera was pointed toward Isabella. Again and again. Dozens of photographs. Always Isabella. Ethan began moving through the crowd. The man noticed. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Then he turned and disappeared. By the time Ethan reached the area where he had been standing, he was gone. No one knew his name. No one remembered inviting him. And no one could explain where he had gone. Minutes later, Isabella's phone vibrated. Still annoyed by Ethan's concerns, she glanced down expecting another message from a friend. Instead, her smile vanished. 3 words appeared on the screen. "We see you." As election day drew closer, the atmosphere around the Monroe campaign changed. What had once felt like a confident march toward victory now felt increasingly tense. Security teams expanded their presence. Federal agents remained in regular contact with campaign officials. Every threat was analyzed. Every suspicious report was investigated. Richard Monroe tried to focus on speeches, interviews, and debates, but the pressure was becoming impossible to ignore. Poll numbers suggested he was still leading comfortably, yet the threats surrounding his family had become more frequent and more specific. Someone clearly wanted the Monroes frightened. The question was why. For Isabella, however, the growing tension only increased her frustration. She was tired of security briefings, tired of escorts, tired of having every movement monitored. Most of all, she was tired of Ethan Cole. No matter where she went, he was there. Restaurants, charity events, shopping trips, political fundraisers. He never complained, never demanded attention, and never left her side. To Ethan, it was a job. To Isabella, it felt like a prison sentence. She convinced herself that everyone was overreacting and that the threats would eventually disappear like every other inconvenience in her life. Then came the fundraiser that changed everything. The event was held at a private country estate several hours outside Hartford. Wealthy donors gathered beneath elegant white tents while campaign staff worked tirelessly behind the scenes. Richard spent the evening meeting supporters and discussing strategy. Ethan maintained his usual position near Isabella, quietly observing the crowd. Nothing appeared unusual. Security was tight. The guest list had been thoroughly screened. On paper, it was one of the safest events of the entire campaign. But Isabella wasn't thinking about security. She was thinking about freedom. Near the end of the evening, while staff members focused on preparing Richard for a late-night interview, Isabella made a decision. She slipped away from the event without notifying security. One of her friends had invited her to an exclusive gathering several towns away, and she was determined to enjoy one evening without bodyguards, schedules, or rules. She left through a side exit, entered her SUV, and instructed the driver to leave immediately. By the time Ethan realized she was gone, she was already miles away. For most people, it would have seemed like a harmless act of rebellion. For Ethan, it felt like a nightmare. The moment he discovered Isabella had disappeared, a familiar feeling settled over him. Every instinct he had developed during years of military service began screaming that something was wrong. He immediately started making calls, checking routes, and reviewing information gathered over the previous weeks. The threatening messages, the surveillance, the mysterious photographer, the black sedan. Individually, they were concerning. Together, they painted a much darker picture. Ethan climbed into his truck and began tracking her location. Meanwhile, heavy rain moved across the region. Dark clouds swallowed the sky. Visibility deteriorated. Traffic disappeared from the roads. Inside her SUV, Isabella laughed with her friend as they drove through the storm. For the first time in months, she felt free. No bodyguard, no security detail, no lectures from her father. She looked out at the rain-covered highway and felt relieved. Then she noticed headlights behind them. At first, it didn't seem unusual. Then another vehicle appeared. And another. The first SUV accelerated. The second moved alongside them. Within seconds, Isabella realized they weren't being followed by coincidence. They were being hunted. The driver's expression changed instantly. He pressed harder on the accelerator as the vehicles behind them closed the distance. Rain hammered against the windshield. Tires struggled for traction on the slick pavement. Isabella grabbed her phone, suddenly aware that something was terribly wrong. Before she could dial for help, one of the pursuing vehicles slammed into the rear of their SUV. The impact shook the entire vehicle. Metal screamed. Glass cracked. The driver fought desperately to maintain control. Another vehicle surged forward. This time the collision came from the side. The SUV spun violently across the highway. Isabella screamed. The world outside became a blur of rain, headlights, and chaos. Then came the gunfire. The sound was unmistakable. Bullets shattered windows. The driver slumped forward. The vehicle left the roadway and crashed through a guardrail before rolling down an embankment. By the time it finally stopped, Isabella could barely understand what had happened. Blood ran down her face. Smoke filled the cabin. Pain shot through her body. For a terrifying moment, she believed she was going to die. The attackers were already approaching. Their headlights cut through the rain. Dark figures moved toward the wreckage, and there was nobody left to stop them, except Ethan Cole. Miles away, Ethan had already anticipated the possibility of an attack. The moment Isabella vanished from the fundraiser, he began tracking her location through emergency security systems installed by the Monroe team. Every clue from the past several weeks pointed toward this exact scenario. He knew she had become vulnerable. He knew someone had been waiting for an opportunity, and now that opportunity had arrived. When Ethan reached the scene, he didn't hesitate. He drove directly into the chaos. His truck slammed into one of the attackers' vehicles, forcing it off the road. Before the men could react, Ethan was already moving through the rain toward the wrecked SUV. Gunfire erupted around him. Bullets struck nearby metal and shattered glass. Yet he kept advancing. Years of military training took over. Every movement was deliberate. Every decision calculated. He reached Isabella first. She stared at him in disbelief. The same man she had mocked. The same man she had laughed at. The same man she had treated like he was beneath her. Now standing between her and death. As attackers continued firing, Ethan shielded her with his own body and dragged her away from the wreckage. He returned fire. He forced the attackers back. He bought precious seconds that allowed emergency responders and law enforcement to close in on the location. But survival came at a cost. A bullet struck his shoulder. Another tore through his side. Then a third hit him as he pushed Isabella behind cover. Still, he refused to stop. Only when he was certain she was safe did his strength begin to fade. As sirens echoed through the distance and the attackers fled into the darkness, Ethan collapsed onto the rain-soaked ground. Isabella rushed toward him. For the first time, she wasn't looking at him as an employee, or a bodyguard, or a man she considered beneath her. She was looking at the person who had just risked everything to save her life. Then she noticed something. One of the attackers had dropped a folder during the chaos. Inside were photographs, campaign schedules, maps, information about Richard Monroe. Not Isabella. Richard. As Ethan struggled to remain conscious, a chilling realization hit her. The attack had never been about her at all. She had simply been the easiest way to get to her father. The attack sent shockwaves far beyond the Monroe family. Before sunrise, law enforcement agencies from multiple jurisdictions had converged on the crash site. State police secured the area. Federal agents began collecting evidence. Investigators worked through the night, piecing together every detail of what had happened on that rain-soaked highway. By morning, the story had become national news. Television networks interrupted regular programming. Political commentators filled entire segments discussing the attack. Social media exploded with theories, accusations, and speculation. What had started as a cynic campaign was rapidly turning into one of the biggest stories in America. Inside a Hartford hospital, Ethan Cole underwent emergency surgery while doctors fought to stabilize his condition. Richard Monroe refused to leave the waiting room. For the first time in years, campaign meetings and election strategies no longer mattered. His daughter's life had nearly been taken. A man hired to protect her was now fighting for his own survival. Meanwhile, Isabella sat quietly nearby, replaying the attack over and over in her mind. Every gunshot, every decision, every moment Ethan placed himself between her and danger. The guilt was becoming impossible to ignore. Outside the hospital, reporters camped around the clock. News helicopters circled overhead. Every major network wanted answers. Who was responsible? Why was the Monroe family targeted? Was the attack politically motivated? With Election Day only days away, the timing seemed too suspicious to ignore. Political analysts immediately focused on Richard Monroe's opponents. Some suggested desperate rivals had resorted to intimidation after falling behind in the polls. Others believed extremist groups opposed to his campaign could be responsible. The theories multiplied by the hour. Federal investigators refused to jump to conclusions. Instead, they followed every lead available. Financial records were reviewed. Communications were examined. Security footage was collected from dozens of locations. The attack had clearly required planning, resources, and coordination. Whoever organized it wasn't acting alone. Yet every promising lead seemed to create more questions than answers. One moment investigators believed they were tracking political operatives. The next, evidence pointed elsewhere entirely. The deeper they dug, the more confusing the picture became. Then attention shifted toward Richard Monroe's business history. Over decades in the corporate world, he had accumulated competitors, lawsuits, and former associates who weren't always pleased with his success. Investigators began examining whether an old business rivalry had evolved into something more dangerous. Several names surfaced. A few appeared capable of funding an operation like the attack. Others had publicly criticized Richard for years. Reporters seized upon these possibilities, fueling endless speculation. Yet once again, every lead eventually reached a dead end. Another theory quickly gained traction. Some analysts suggested foreign interests might be involved. Richard's company operated internationally, and his Senate campaign had attracted attention far beyond Connecticut. Federal authorities quietly examined the possibility that overseas actors could have viewed his election as a threat. Certain communications appeared suspicious. Several financial transactions required closer examination. For a brief period, investigators believed they might finally be closing in on the truth. But that theory also collapsed under scrutiny. The evidence simply didn't support it. Days passed. The nation kept watching, and the real mastermind remained hidden. What investigators didn't realize was that they were looking in the wrong direction. Every theory assumed the threat originated outside the Monroe family's inner circle. Every suspect came from beyond the campaign, beyond the businesses, beyond the people Richard trusted most. Yet the evidence collected from the crash site told a very different story. Whoever planned the attack possessed information that should have been impossible to obtain. Private schedules, security routes, last-minute campaign changes, details known only to a handful of insiders. That realization changed everything. Federal investigators began examining people closest to Richard Monroe: staff members, advisors, security personnel, campaign executives, individuals who had access to confidential information. Hundreds of interviews followed. Financial records were reviewed again. Phone data was analyzed. Relationships were scrutinized. Slowly, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. One individual appeared repeatedly whenever sensitive information leaked. At first, the connections seemed insignificant. Then they became impossible to ignore. The breakthrough came from a series of encrypted communications recovered from a device connected to the investigation. Messages had been exchanged over several months. They referenced campaign movements, travel plans, and security arrangements. Whoever sent them wasn't gathering information from afar. They were receiving it directly from someone on the inside. Someone who sat in strategy meetings. Someone who heard private conversations. Someone who understood exactly how the Monroe operation functioned. The evidence was undeniable. The mastermind behind the attack wasn't a political rival. He wasn't a foreign operative. He wasn't a forgotten business enemy seeking revenge. He was much closer than anyone imagined. Someone Richard Monroe trusted. Someone welcomed into private meetings. Someone who smiled beside the family while secretly helping coordinate the very people trying to destroy them. And the most terrifying part was this: that person had been sitting beside them for months. While federal investigators worked to uncover the person responsible for the attack, a different battle was unfolding inside Hartford Memorial Hospital. Ethan Cole had survived the emergency surgery, but only barely. The 3 gunshot wounds had caused extensive damage, and doctors remained cautious about his recovery. For days, machines monitored every heartbeat. Nurses moved quietly through his room. Family members of other patients came and went. Yet one visitor appeared more consistently than anyone else: Isabella Monroe. At first, she told herself she was only there because she felt responsible. After all, Ethan had been injured protecting her. It seemed like the right thing to do. But as the days passed, she found herself returning even when she had no reason to. Sometimes she sat silently beside his bed. Sometimes she listened as doctors explained his condition. Other times, she simply watched the man she once mocked fighting through pain that would have broken most people. And slowly, something inside her began to change. For months, Isabella had viewed Ethan through the lens of wealth and status. She judged his truck, his clothes, his salary, his lifestyle. Without realizing it, she had reduced an entire human being to a number in a bank account. But sitting beside his hospital bed, those things suddenly felt meaningless. The man lying there had willingly stepped into gunfire for her. He had risked everything to protect someone who had rarely shown him respect. No amount of money could buy that kind of courage. No social status could manufacture that kind of loyalty. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It happened in small moments. A nurse mentioning how polite Ethan remained despite his pain. A doctor commenting on his determination during recovery. Security officers stopping by to express admiration for what he had done. Everywhere Isabella turned, people spoke about Ethan with genuine respect, not because of what he owned, but because of who he was. For the first time, she began wondering how much she had failed to understand about the man she thought she knew. One afternoon, while Ethan was still recovering, Isabella found herself speaking with an older woman seated in the hospital waiting area. The woman introduced herself as Margaret Cole, Ethan's mother. Their conversation started politely enough. But as they talked, Isabella discovered pieces of Ethan's life she had never imagined. Margaret spoke proudly about her son, though not about his military medals or professional accomplishments. Instead, she described his character, his work ethic, the sacrifices he made for others. Then she mentioned something that caught Isabella completely off guard. There was a time when our family had more money than we knew what to do with, Margaret said quietly. Isabella frowned. The statement didn't fit anything she thought she knew about Ethan. Margaret smiled sadly before continuing. Years earlier, Ethan's father had owned a successful manufacturing company that employed hundreds of people throughout Connecticut. The business had been growing rapidly. Their family lived comfortably. Opportunities seemed endless. Then everything changed. A trusted business partner manipulated financial records, diverted company funds, and ultimately orchestrated a scheme that destroyed the business from within. By the time the truth emerged, the company was bankrupt. The fallout devastated the family. They lost their home. Their savings disappeared. Friends vanished. People who once praised them suddenly turned away. Ethan was still young when it happened, but old enough to remember every painful detail. Instead of allowing bitterness to define him, he chose a different path. He worked. He studied. He joined the military. He built a life through discipline and determination. Every achievement he earned afterward came without privilege or shortcuts. The more Isabella listened, the more stunned she became. Ethan hadn't grown up poor. He had experienced both sides of life. He knew what it felt like to have everything and then lose it all. And somehow, he had emerged stronger. That evening, Isabella sat alone in Ethan's hospital room long after visiting hours should have ended. She looked around at the simple belongings resting near his bed. A few personal photographs, military challenge coins, letters from former teammates. Nothing extravagant, nothing designed to impress anyone. Yet every item seemed to tell a story she had completely missed. For the first time, she felt ashamed. Not because Ethan was poor, but because she had assumed she understood him. The truth was that she knew almost nothing about him at all. She had mistaken humility for weakness, discipline for lack of ambition, silence for lack of confidence. Everything she believed about Ethan Cole had been wrong. Every single thing. And as she sat beside him that night, watching the steady rise and fall of his breathing, Isabella Monroe found herself thinking something she never thought possible. The man she once looked down on might be the strongest person she had ever met. The breakthrough finally came 3 days before Election Day. After weeks of investigation, federal agents executed multiple search warrants across Connecticut and uncovered the evidence they had been chasing from the beginning. The person responsible for leaking confidential campaign information wasn't a political opponent or a foreign operative. It was Daniel Mercer, one of Richard Monroe's most trusted senior campaign advisors. For nearly 8 months, Mercer had secretly provided sensitive information to individuals connected to the attack. Every schedule change, every security adjustment, every private movement. Information the attackers could never have obtained on their own. The revelation stunned everyone. Daniel Mercer had attended strategy meetings, shared family dinners, and stood beside Richard during some of the most important moments of the campaign. He wasn't just an employee. He was considered a friend. Yet investigators discovered that years of financial problems and resentment had made him vulnerable to manipulation. What began as small leaks eventually evolved into something far more dangerous. By the time Mercer realized how serious the situation had become, he was already trapped. The people he worked with wanted one thing above all else: Richard Monroe's political destruction. The arrests made national headlines. News networks covered the story nonstop. Analysts dissected every detail. Public sympathy for the Monroe family surged almost overnight. But despite the chaos, Richard Monroe refused to let fear define the final days of his campaign. He continued traveling across the state, meeting voters and delivering speeches. This time, however, he did so with a deeper appreciation for how close he had come to losing everything. More than once, he admitted privately that if Ethan Cole hadn't acted when he did, the outcome could have been devastating. Then election night arrived. Across Connecticut, voters filled polling stations while news organizations prepared for one of the most closely watched Senate races in the country. Campaign staff gathered inside a packed ballroom awaiting results. Supporters watched giant screens displaying county-by-county updates. Reporters crowded every available corner. As the evening progressed, it became increasingly clear that Richard Monroe was heading toward victory. When the final projections appeared, the room erupted into celebration. Years of work had paid off. The campaign had survived scandal, threats, and violence. Richard Monroe had won. For most people, that should have been the ending. The mastermind had been arrested. The threat had been eliminated. The family was safe. Justice had been served. But the most important part of the story was only beginning. Several weeks later, Ethan Cole was finally discharged from the hospital. Recovery had been slow and painful, but he was determined to regain his strength. One afternoon, while settling into a quieter routine away from politics and media attention, he heard a knock at his door. Standing outside was Isabella Monroe. For the first time since they met, there were no security vehicles nearby, no assistants, no expensive entourage, no carefully crafted public image. Just Isabella. She looked nervous, something Ethan had never seen before. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Isabella finally broke the silence. She apologized, not for one specific comment or mistake, for everything, for judging him, for mocking him, for assuming she understood his life, for treating him like he mattered less because he had less money. The words came slowly at first, then all at once. Months of guilt, gratitude, and self-reflection poured out in a conversation she should have had long ago. When she finished, Ethan looked at her quietly. Then something happened that Isabella realized she had never seen before. He smiled. Not the polite professional expression he used around clients. Not the restrained smile of someone doing his job. A genuine smile. The kind that reached his eyes. And in that moment, something between them changed forever. The weeks that followed felt completely different from the months before the attack. Without bodyguard assignments and security protocols standing between them, they finally had the chance to know each other as people. They shared meals, took long walks, talked about their childhoods, fears, and ambitions. Ethan showed Isabella parts of Connecticut she had never noticed despite living there her entire life. Isabella introduced Ethan to passions and interests she had rarely shared with anyone. What surprised them both was how naturally everything developed. There was no dramatic confession, no grand gesture, no perfect movie moment. Just two people gradually realizing they enjoyed being together. Friendship became trust. Trust became affection. Affection slowly became something neither of them could ignore. For the first time in years, Isabella found herself valuing character more than status. And for the first time in a very long time, Ethan allowed himself to believe that happiness might actually be possible. Months later, long after the election headlines disappeared and the investigation faded from public attention, they were spotted walking together through a quiet waterfront park near Mystic. No reporters followed them. No security teams surrounded them. No campaign schedules dictated where they needed to be. Richard Monroe's daughter and her former bodyguard walked side by side, hand in hand, smiling at a future neither of them could have imagined when they first met. The millionaire heiress who once mocked him for being poor no longer saw wealth as the measure of a person's worth. And the bodyguard she once underestimated had become the man she trusted more than anyone else in the world. In the end, the attack that nearly destroyed both of their lives revealed something neither expected to find. Not fear, not revenge, not even justice, but love. And sometimes, the people we judge the fastest become the people who change our lives forever. Sometimes the people we judge the fastest become the people who change our lives the most. When Isabella Monroe first met Ethan Cole, she saw an old pickup truck, an inexpensive watch, and a man whose bank account couldn't compete with the world she came from. She assumed wealth measured value. She assumed status determined importance. And because of those assumptions, She completely missed what was standing right in front of her. She didn't see the years of sacrifice. She didn't see the discipline forged through hardship. She didn't see the courage that had carried him through challenges most people would never survive. The truth is that character rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive in luxury cars or designer clothing. It doesn't demand attention in crowded rooms. More often, it reveals itself during the moments that matter most. When fear takes over. When difficult choices must be made. When protecting someone else becomes more important than protecting yourself. Ethan Cole never asked Isabella to respect him. He never tried to impress her. He simply lived by principles that money could never purchase and status could never replace. Looking back, the signs had always been there. Every insult he ignored. Every warning he gave. Every responsibility he accepted without complaint. The qualities Isabella once dismissed as ordinary were actually the very qualities that saved her life. And by the time she finally recognized them, she realized something far more important. The richest person in the room isn't always the one with the most money. Sometimes it's the person with the strongest values, the deepest integrity, and the courage to do what's right even when nobody is watching. In many ways, the attack changed both of them. Isabella learned that privilege doesn't make someone invincible. Ethan learned that people are capable of changing when they're willing to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. Together, they discovered that trust is earned through actions, not words. And perhaps that's why their story resonated with so many people. Because beneath the wealth, politics, danger, and headlines, it was ultimately a story about seeing someone for who they truly are. Now we'd love to hear your thoughts. If you were in Isabella Monroe's position, would you have trusted Ethan Cole from the very beginning? Or do you think you might have made the same mistake she did and judged him based on appearances? And if you were Ethan, would you have been able to forgive someone who treated you the way Isabella treated him? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read as many comments as possible, and we'd love to hear your perspective on this story. And if you thought this story was unbelievable, wait until you hear what happened when a billionaire CEO fired a janitor for what seemed like a simple mistake, only to discover a secret that changed everything he thought he knew. Trust us, that story takes an even more shocking turn than this one. So if you enjoyed today's video, make sure you subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us for the next incredible story. Until then, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.